Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. I am very happy that you're joining us here today. We have some in the audience in person and many of you joining us online. Welcome. We are here to discuss a very important theme: immigration, refugees, and race in Japan, a turning point. Amid an aging population crisis, the Japanese government has been starting to look at the possibility that immigration may help to boost its labor force and strengthen the country overall. The government has implemented a significant immigration reform in 2019 that expanded the visa programs, allowing the possibility for as many as 345,000 new workers to enter Japan over the coming 5 years. This would be a significant expansion in the number of foreign workers in Japan, but we can also recognize that the number of foreign-born residents in Japan has been increasing since the 1970s to reach almost 3 million in the recent years. The majority of these immigrants to Japan are from neighboring Asian countries. Almost a quarter are from China, 16% from Vietnam, 15% from Korea, and 10% from the Philippines. Indeed, myself as a scholar of trade policy, I was fascinated to see recent trade agreements have had provisions to expand the labor force. Of course, we know that the historic commercial and friendship agreements that Japan first concluded addressed the ability for Japanese immigrants to go to the United States and Australia in the beginning of the 20th century. But now it is Japan that is negotiating trade agreements that include provisions to allow for foreign workers to come to Japan. Recently, we saw the Japan-Philippines Economic Partnership Agreement, which took place in 2008 as the first of these agreements. It included a program to increase the number of Filipino nurses practicing in Japan. The critical healthcare sector needed more talented and skilled workers. However, the results of this program have been somewhat disappointing, with only 7% of the candidates passing the program's rigorous requirements during the period 2009 to 2011 after the agreement went into effect. Today, the total number of nurses from the Philippines approved to work in Japan is only 15. So clearly there's interest, but there's much to be done to realize the goal of diversifying the population and expanding the workforce through immigration. As the world population of refugees around the world has increased due to conflicts, including most recently the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a very wide discussion around the world about how to engage refugee policy to advance industrial democracies, to allow opportunities for these refugees to find new homes. The question is, will Japan join in providing homes to these desperate refugees? Today, we will learn more about the efforts to integrate immigrants and refugees in Japan, which has brought many challenges at the level of policy and society. We are very fortunate to have with us a leading set of experts to discuss this important topic. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Michael Sharpe, Associate Professor of Political Science at York College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Dr. Sharpe has published extensively on the politics of immigration and migration, looking carefully at the political incorporation of immigrants within society. He is the author of Post-Colonial Citizens and Ethnic Migration, The Netherlands and Japan in the Age of Globalization, published by Palgrave in 2014. He's also written several articles that examine Japanese descendants and their experience returning to Japan, including a publication in the Japanese Journal of Political Science and in Policy and Society, which has looked carefully at definitions of citizenship. This year, he is working to complete his book, The Politics of Racism and Anti-Racism in Japan, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press. After the presentation by Dr. Sharpe, we will have our second presenter, Dr. Nicholas Fraser, who is the Policy Innovations Fellow at the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. Dr. Fraser researches how politics, as well as the bureaucratic and judicial procedures, influence immigration politics. Among his recent co-authored articles, he has written on the role of humanitarianism shaping public attitudes towards refugees, published in Political Psychology, and another article that examined, do natives prefer white immigrants, evidence from Japan, published in Ethnic and Racial Studies. He's currently working on a book on bureaucratic politics and the shape of asylum policy. Building on his research, he is going to be doing research at Harvard this year on public opinion and the impact on Japan's approach to refugee protection. Our seminar today is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center Research Cluster on Migration and the Harvard Undergraduate Japan Policy Network. It is part of our special series on policy innovations and crises supported by a grant from the Japan Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to introduce our seminar for next week before we turn over to our speakers. Next week, we will have a discussion of artificial intelligence and the future of domestic work. We are very fortunate to have Nobuko Nagase, visiting scholar of the Department of Sociology, join us to present her research, with Mary Britton, director of the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, serving as the moderator. We hope you can join us at this time next week. And I'd like to remind you of our Zoom etiquette. Please keep your microphone muted. And if you have questions after our two speakers present, they will each present for about 15 minutes. We'll have time for questions where you can write a question in the chat or raise your hand. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here again at Harvard University. Thanks very much to Dr. Shinju Fujihira, Jennifer Chris, and Professor Davis, the program on U.S.-Japan relations, and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs for having me. As Professor Davis said, this is a preview of the first chapter of my forthcoming book. So it's a work in progress, so your comments are very welcome. Uh-oh. Why is this not moving? Let's see.
I think you have to advance it with the arrows.
Wow.
Well, this doesn't take away from my 15 minutes.
Yeah, right. I think you'll have to.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, all right.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, oh, that's not working either.
let's see. So maybe it's a click.
Okay.
So I think,
All right.
yeah, click. is
Just click.
something,
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. All right. Since the mid-2000s, there has been fierce demonstrations between far-right, ultra-nationalist, and anti-racist movements. Pernicious hate speech and harassment from groups such as Zaito Kukai calls anti-Koreans criminals, cockroaches, and called for their murder. This and allied groups have derided new migrants. Hate speech on social media platforms include derogatory messages aimed at Burakumin, which are Japan's caste minority, and racist tropes against famous mixed-race, half-food Japanese celebrities, such as Miss Universe Japan, Ariana Miyamoto, Naomi Osaka, Rui Hachimura. But their achievements and popularity complicate mainstream accounts. The murder of George Floyd sparked Black Lives demonstrations in Tokyo and Osaka in June 2020, both in solidarity with the struggle against racism and police brutality in the United States, and to raise awareness about these issues in Japan. The more recent anti-racist movements, including BLM protests, reflect a historic current of anti-racist solidarity and coalition building. Varied racisms against quote unquote invisible races and visible racialized others merge, intersect, and depart at various venues. So the modern concept of race is influenced, whoops, I need to go back, is influenced by the European Enlightenment with its emphasis on rationalism, linear progress, observation, and classification of natural and social phenomena. Racism and anti-racism are often intermingled and difficult to separate in that one is the inverse of the other. So I just want to emphasize here this concept of race. Similar to Sinti and Roma and Turks in Europe, groups such as Zainichi Koreans and Burakumin in Japan are racialized by social discourses that see them as having inborn internal differences in terms of bodies, abilities, and temperament. Anti-racism referred to strategies of resistance against racism by using racial identity itself as a tool of collective mobilization, coalition building, and transnational solidarity. Race in contemporary Japan is often thought of as a Black-white issue or a problem emblematic of heterogeneous Western societies, or one that does not apply to Japan. In this way, racism in Japan has a similar function to colorblind racism in the Netherlands or Brazil, where racism is denied, which stresses formal equality and inequality as individual responsibility, thus perpetuating racism. But it parts company because in Japan, racism is viewed as simply insignificant or non-existent inside Japan because of the notion of homogeneity. So what explains Japan's divergence and developments around race and anti-racism in a country that has deployed race as a tool of cohesion and solidarity against Western imperialism, weaponizing it as a mechanism of superiority, and dismisses it as irrelevant? So I use a comparative politics, racial politics analytical framework to examine race as a political phenomenon and how race works. I argue that Japan is the world's first non-white modern power, both mirrors the Western trajectory, where racial politics has been central to modern state building and departs into strategic deployment of racism and anti-racism by the state, civil society, social movements, national and international coalitions, and solidarity networks. I argue that race is a better unit of analysis than ethnicity for an assessment of a centralized racial difference in Japan, because race implies hierarchy, where groups are ascribed with certain attributes that are treated as fixed or given under certain conditions. The existing literature trends towards specific groups and problematizes xenophobia, but does not necessarily examine the interactive relationship between racism and anti-racism in Japan. So I analyze a variety of data sources to assess the impacts of changing internal and external dynamics on racial politics in Japan, including review of relevant scholarly literature, newspaper anecdotes, policy documents, interviews with NGOs, activists, politicians, and policymakers. Contrary to common sense notions of homogeneity, modern Japan has always had minorities and migrants. These invisible minorities constitute some 4 to 6% of the Japanese population. It is important to note that each traditionally subordinated group in Japan has been racialized in historical documents in immutable biological and hierarchical terms as quote unquote inferior races. Ainu as uncivilized and a dying race, Burakumin, a race apart, ruthless and cruel, Okinawans, Koreans, and Chinese as barbarians and alien race. Until 2019, post-war Japan officially prohibited unskilled foreign labor. Facing demographic and labor shortages, 1990s reforms created side doors for unskilled foreign migrants. A new immigration policy was announced, as Professor Davis noted, in February 18, that opened the country to multitudes of unskilled foreigners. But at the same time, the Prime Minister said that his government has no intention of adopting an immigration policy. The number of foreign residents was a little less than 3 million in 2019, or 2.32% of the population. This has fostered a new diversity and a reordering of marginalized hierarchy of older, invisible, post-colonial, Asian, and newer, visible, marginalized groups. The race thinking of Japan's Meiji era intellectuals permeated public discourse, law, policy, state institutions, and administrative practices. As a non-white and hence quote unquote inferior people, Japanese intellectuals and policymakers were in a rather compromised racial position and initiated many iterations of what I call racial gymnastics towards racial betterment. Prominent Japanese intellectuals and political elites of this period appropriated Western racial ideologies, including those pertaining to miscegenation, social Darwinism, and eugenics to create a Japanese version aimed at, quote unquote, improving the Japanese race. Racism and anti-racism permeated the Meiji Restoration's attempts to confront Western imperialism by building national cohesion with mono-ethnic nationalism and imperial government policies. The official end of feudalism in 1871 coincides with the Edict of Emancipation's superficial abolishment of Buraku caste discrimination, and their ordering, along with the internal colonialism and homogenization of the Ainu and Okinawan indigenous minorities, constituted as alien races, primitive or racially immature. The intellectual Fukuzawa popularized Blumenbach's taxonomy of the 5 races and the idea of racial hierarchy, but replaced geography with color, situating the yellow race in between Black and white and ranking Japan amongst semi-civilized countries en route to becoming civilized. Taguchi Ukichi and other influential thinkers justified the Meiji slogan and policy of leave Asia and join the West on the claim that the Japanese were Aryans and Caucasians, and in fact, Europeans were stealing their ancestors. The thinking was Japan must achieve the same level not to face potential Western domination like China and other non-Western powers, and so must leave Asia. Hence, the invention of a Japanese race would happen over time in combination with international influences and the subordination of other races within and outside of Japan's sovereignty. The instrumental duality of Japan's transnational racial solidarities centered on Pan-Asianism as an affront to Western imperialism and white supremacy on the one hand, and as the rationale for its own imperialistic expansion in Asia on the other. Colonial expansion signals the beginning of a new nationalism built around a multi-ethnic empire, where ideologies of Japanese superiority legitimated the brutal racial denigration of Asian subjects. This was in fact a multi-ethnic empire that strived to colonize, with the Japanese at the top of the hierarchy and the denigration of other Asians as people as backwards and inferior. Surprisingly, Japan's 1908 defeat of Russia and its racial equality bill proposal at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference challenged white supremacy. It precipitated Afro-Asian solidarity and was the unintended precursor for a racial equality norm in international relations. Japan's claim to serve as a champion of the darker races inspired transnational solidarity with African-American and anti-colonial intellectuals, such as Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay. It's worth noting that with Japan's defeat after World War II and the end of empire, the occupation imposed injunctions against racial discourse in the Japanese media that aimed to contain agitation from Japanese as people of color. The peace constitution's ambiguities around racial equality to prohibit caste and race-based discrimination, but with no mention of discrimination against post-colonial Asian former subjects. So with this, those post-colonial former subjects, they are stripped of their citizenship, and there is what John Lee would call an unmixing of Japan and the re-embrace of homogeneity. Okay. So Article 14 of Japan's constitution guarantees protections against racial discrimination, but there is no law in its criminal or civil code that makes discrimination by race an illegal or criminal offense. It has avoided implementation of a national law against discrimination on the basis that discrimination itself is not a serious enough problem. Okay, so the post-war liberal context and the international human rights regime that emerged in the aftermath of the racial atrocities of the Holocaust and genocide committed during World War II. Like elsewhere, leftists and student activists emerged as formidable political actors in the 1960s and 1970s Japan, with mass protests against the Vietnam War, the US troops in Asia, and environmental degradation. These protests were in part inspired by civil rights movement and also the increasing utilization of international human rights mechanisms. This coincided and strengthened minority activism for rights and recognition, namely the Buraku Liberation Movement and social movements by Zainichi Koreans, Okinawans, and Ainu. Okay. So there are various tools of coalition building and solidarity have been used to achieve anti-racist objectives in the Japanese context. The 1969 law on special measures for Dowa projects, right, refers to Buraku people. Chung notes by the 1980s, Japan's welfare benefits for settled foreign residents in Japan were amongst the most generous in the world. Inspired by, and this has a lot to do with the Zainichi Korean movement that won these rights. But particularly in the case of welfare benefits and legal protections. But these may be inadequate for newer migrants. Accession to international conventions removes Japanese nationality restrictions in the areas of the national pension system and public housing. So I can't go through these all, I know I'm running out of time. But also, there's international solidarity between Buraku and Dalit communities in India, and with the argument that descent-based discrimination is racial discrimination. In 2008, the Ainu are finally recognized as an indigenous people in Japan through interaction with indigenous movements worldwide. Okay. All right, so let me keep going. How am I doing on time? Oh, good, all right. All right, so racism persists in Japan. The national narrative of monoethnicity and homogeneity leaves little room for minorities or difference. The aforementioned 1990s immigration reform has resulted in increased diversity, but this has fostered a reordering of marginalized hierarchy based on visa status, skin color, country of origin, and class. The UN has issued scathing reports on racism and discrimination in Japan. And in 2017, the government released the results of its first national survey on racial and ethnic discrimination. So these findings notwithstanding, the state's disavowal of racism and its lack of a law against racial discrimination is a mechanism of management of racial conflict by minimizing its existence. So let me talk a bit about the role of the state. So the Japan case shows the role of the state in creating hierarchies of citizens and non-citizens and various racisms and anti-racist strategies for those that share and differ from the Semitic norm. Colonial exclusion led to contemporary structures of inequality for low-skilled immigrants and new hierarchies of semi-citizenship for Zainichi Korean and Chinese old-comers, still categorized as aliens and foreigners. Japan's government organizes its labor market hierarchically, according to race and nationality, with Zainichi Koreans and Nikkei-jin, as well as educated people from advanced countries at the higher ends with better jobs and pay and less visa restrictions, and South Asians and Southeast Asians at the lower end with more casual and dangerous jobs, lower pay, and more precarious visa conditions. Older, invisible, post-colonial non-citizens are denizens or special permanent residents. They are advantaged with native Japanese language and culture, exempt from the fingerprinting legal requirement, and cannot be deported. Asian, brown, and Black people from developing countries tend to be in the more rigid student, entertainment, and other casual categories where they're expected to leave Japan and are deportable. Various racisms are observed in Japan: anti-caste, anti-indigenous, anti-Asian, anti-brown, anti-Black. So analysis of these racisms should include the role of the state in producing and reproducing these important dimensions as an underlying logic of denying equality based on if not sole supremacy, then Japanese uniqueness. So in conclusion, Japan both challenged white supremacy and borrowed and adapted Western racial ideation to form its own racial ideologies to justify internal and external colonialism. It is a very important example of a state that has gone through multiple self-rejections, from homogeneous family state to multi-ethnic empire to post-war monoracial liberal democracy. The case shows the role of the state in creating hierarchies of citizens and non-citizens and various racism and anti-racist strategies for those who share and differ from the Semitic norm. Racism and anti-racism are important tests of Japan's liberal democracy. Depending on how old and new marginalized groups are incorporated and rights realized in Japan, the country could be a model of acceptance and democratic inclusion, or an exemplar of illiberal intolerance and exclusion for the region and the world. Thank you very much.
Okay, you want to go ahead? Sure. If you choose.
So it's just a clicker, right?
The mouse works.
Okay. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank the program on US-Japan relations for hosting this event, but also for bringing me here to be a Policy Innovations Fellow. And I want to thank Professor Michael Sharpe, whose research has had a huge impact on myself and other people who are studying this topic. So I'm going to talk to you about contemporary public attitudes towards immigrants. All right, technical difficulties. So you might have this assumption that Japan is strongly opposed to immigration, and that's because it has a policy legacy that's very strict. What do I mean by strict? Well, there's three dimensions that I would classify that make it strict. First, there's a heavy rotation of foreign workers, as was touched on in the previous presentation. So it's very hard for people to settle long-term in Japan. Second, Japan has a very strict, arguably the strictest refugee and asylum policy in the developed world, despite the fact that the demand for asylum has grown significantly. Last year, there was something like 5,000 to 6,000 applications for refugee status. In 2017, Japan received the most asylum applications, sitting at around 20,000, making it comparable to countries like Canada, the United States, and European countries. Japan is not a country that does not receive asylum claims. They're receiving more and more. So it's very strict on that. It tends to reject the vast majority and grant asylum to maybe about 100 people or less, so less than 1%. In addition to these aspects, there's also an absence of national integration policies. So it is possible to naturalize, to become a Japanese citizen, but there aren't any policies at the national level designed to sort of help people get towards naturalization. There are a lot of local integration policies done by city governments, by prefectural governments, but there's no national guidance on this. So these factors combined make Japan's immigration policy comparatively very strict. And despite recent reforms, all of these aspects currently remain in place. So they're going to bring in more foreign workers, but again, it's very hard to settle in Japan. So you might assume, as many people do, that this strict policy legacy reflects public opinion, that the public doesn't want immigration. And certainly there has been a lot of coverage of this issue in the local media, in international media. Pundits have speculated on why Japan has this strict immigration policy. And there are a lot of various surveys done by newspapers in Japan that argue that the public doesn't want immigrants. But the problem with those polls is that a lot depends on how you ask the question. Most of these newspaper polls don't ask the same question more than once, and they often ask a very unrepresentative sample of people. There is a book called Refugee Problem by Hakata Kei, for instance, that cites one of these polls arguing that the Japanese people are strongly opposed to hosting refugees. And yet, despite the fact that the book goes into great detail on much policy in Europe, the book doesn't really touch on public attitudes in Japan, aside from that one survey, which is an unrepresentative sample. So I think we can do better than that. And recent studies have also been looking at Japanese immigration attitudes. And what I'm going to do today is persuade you that the public is not opposed to immigration. In fact, Japan is very much in line with most of the developed world. Technical difficulties. So what about public attitudes toward foreign workers or economic migrants? So Japanese views are actually very similar to American and European attitudes. There is a preference for high-skilled foreign workers because there's a belief that high-skilled foreign workers across the developed world and in many developing countries, that those are the immigrants who are most likely to benefit the local economy. And there have been countless studies that show this in Japan. There's also evidence from recent studies that Japanese are willing to grant citizenship to high-skilled immigrants from a variety of ethnic backgrounds. So this, again, is in line with where the current literature on immigration attitudes is more broadly. Now, you might think they probably prefer certain groups over others. And in fact, they do. But again, this is similar to American and European attitudes. I want to be very clear that immigration attitudes are complicated. It's not just about skills or race or identity. Often these factors intermingle in very complicated ways. And what we've learned from studying immigration attitudes for 20 or 30 years is that a lot of this comes down to human psychology. People might not have a very consistent or clear understanding of what they want, but they know what they don't want, oftentimes. And a lot of this comes down to how they feel about certain groups. So assuming that economic factors were the only thing that mattered, if we assumed that, as some studies have argued, then we would expect the average citizen to apply purely economic criteria for assessing hypothetical immigrants. And in fact, this is where the literature was about 5 or 6 years ago. But recent qualitative and quantitative studies have shown that actually it's an intermingling of applying economic criteria as well as identity factors. So the average citizen of the United States, Europe, Canada, wherever, is going to apply uneven skill requirements because they favor certain groups over others. And in fact, this is what I found in a recent study in Japan, published in Ethnic and Racial Studies. This was an experiment where I asked people to assess hypothetical immigrant profiles. And we found that Japanese selectively applied skill requirements. This is just a brief overview of that survey. Happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but the key thing to focus on here is medium skills, right? So often these studies, they talk about skilled, high skilled, low skilled, but what does that mean? A lot of that depends on the local context. And when you make the prospective immigrant skills more ambiguous, that's when you start to see identity factors come into play. So this is some of the evidence from that study. And what we found consistently is that when the skill levels were more ambiguous, medium skilled, the people preferred more people from white majority countries such as Australia, as opposed to Syrians or Chinese. We also found in other studies that there is a strong anti-Chinese sentiment. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. What about refugees? I know that some people in the audience have done some research on this as well, so happy to engage with that in the Q&A. But there hasn't really been a lot of research on this. Most of the literature on attitudes towards immigrants has assumed that immigrants come for economic reasons, but that's not the case. Millions of people flee for humanitarian reasons. They flee because they are being persecuted or they do not feel safe. So we have to think about refugees differently than we think about foreign workers. Now, one set of arguments, one idea about public attitudes towards refugees in the broader social science literature argues that, public attitudes are really shaped by media discourse. And so in one study I did with John Chang, we wanted to see, what does the Japanese media think about refugees? And is there maybe a negative portrayal of refugees that somehow contributes to negative attitudes, and that does that maybe have some explanation for why policy is so strict? In fact, we found that media coverage in Japan relative to Western countries is actually not that negative. We found that negative media frames were virtually absent in most media coverage in Japan. What I would say here for context, is that a lot of Japanese newspapers ignore refugee issues, or if they cover them as a problem over there, right? It's not a domestic politics issue, it's a foreign policy issue. And there might be a lot of support for sending money, but it's often not talked about in terms of an immigration issue. What would it take to convince the average Japanese person to support hosting refugees? I can tell you that I was in Japan during 3/11, and I have a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests to me that the people I knew in Tokyo were moved by the fact that an NGO I was a part of, Japan Association for Refugees, was bringing people to do disaster relief work. And some of these people were immigrants and refugees. And I had conversations with my friends in Tokyo, and they said, "Why is our refugee policy so strict?" And we talked about it, and they told me, if these people are willing to give back to Japan in a time of need, then we should take them in. So, that led me to wonder, okay, there haven't really been any studies of this. So let's do a proper survey, again, using a representative sample, not a newspaper poll. And the goal of this study was to see, does humanitarianism, and that is a psychological propensity to help people in need. We can measure it. It's a psychometric measure. Does that predict Japanese support for hosting refugees? If Japan is so different, then humanitarianism shouldn't make a difference, right? In fact, we found evidence that it does. Again, we used a survey experiment. Happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. That's the details of the survey experiment. We manipulated a hypothetical refugee crisis. And here are the results. We asked direct questions, shown here, and the stronger humanitarian sentiment they had, the more likely they were to say, yes, we should admit refugees. This is the result of the experiment. They were particularly supportive of admitting refugees fleeing natural disasters such as earthquake, but also civil war. So humanitarianism is a strong supporter of public support for hosting refugees. And I'm doing further research to build on this to see if this finding is similar in other countries. But needless to say, this contradicts the narrative that Japanese are strongly opposed to hosting refugees. That's just not the case. So what about COVID? In the last few years, COVID has changed our lives in profoundly fundamental ways. And we might expect that the pandemic would lead to a lot of anxiety, linking public health to immigration. And previous studies have shown that there is a psychological association between foreigners and disease, particularly with people who have sensitive behavioral immune systems. And there's this association of foreigners with pathogens. So again, this is psychological factor here. We would expect that the pandemic might create anxiety and decrease support for immigration. Did this happen? Now, there was public support for temporary closing of the border in Japan, but that was universal. Even in countries like Canada, there was public support for closing the border. And Canada is a country known for having strong support for immigration, right? So temporary border closure aside, no. We found evidence that actually public support for immigration is getting stronger. So we did an experiment, again, happy to talk about the details in the Q&A, where we manipulated a speaker, and the speaker is giving an argument in favor of immigration. So we ran the survey before the onset of the pandemic in March of 2019, and then again in late February of 2021. And the second survey was run at a time when Japan was had a high infection rate and was seriously considering whether it should host the Olympics because it didn't want to reopen the border. And what you see here is that higher means between 4 and 4.75 equal more skepticism of these pro-immigrant arguments. And we see that, interestingly, In 2019, there was more skepticism, particularly of arguments made by bureaucrats and that diversity is a good thing. But in 2021, these means drop, and we see more receptivity to the idea that immigration is a good thing. What's notable here is that arguments about helping the manufacturing and agricultural industries, but also that immigration is generally good. There was more support for that, especially arguments made by union leaders and business leaders relative to 2019, whereas when bureaucrats made the argument, there was more skepticism. We're doing further research to explore this, but this contradicts what we would expect, that the pandemic has triggered a public backlash. Happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, but I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. So Japan has this strict policy legacy, right? So it stands to reason that the public must be strongly opposed to immigration and hosting refugees. But I've shown you evidence that that's not the case. Japanese actually support admitting high-skilled foreign workers, as is the case all around the world. They also support hosting refugees, particularly those who have a humanitarian disposition, which I again define as a propensity to help those in need. That transcends culture, race, class. It's psychological. The pandemic has also not weakened Japanese support for immigration, as we would expect it to. In fact, support for immigration is stronger than before the pandemic. I'm happy to talk more about these results in the Q&A, but thank you again for your time and attention. Before I wrap up, this is my email address. If you want to talk or ask me questions, try to challenge what I presented here. I know it's very controversial. I'd be very happy to do that. So I look forward to your comments and your questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you both. Fascinating presentations, and we do have 30 minutes for question and answer. I find it fascinating that Michael has described how the Japanese government has pivoted from denying there is discrimination because it's a homogenous society, championing anti-racism, but imposing a racial hierarchy. And post-war, trying to be a liberal democracy without racism, adopting all of the conventions against racism, but on the ground, poor implementation. And so we're left with a fairly grim picture of some ideals that clearly are not being met. And then Nick has come to show that that gap between an ideal to deny racism and a reality that there appears to be many problems is not the result of discriminatory attitudes, and that the public, if anything, would be open to more engagement through welcoming immigrants and refugees. And it's a fascinating puzzle. And the question, of course, becomes one of what are the politics? Is it that there's a difference in the political incentives that they don't realize the public could support more engagement? Is it that, what do we think are the reasons for these gaps? And I know, Nick, you have done a lot of work on the bureaucratic politics and the judicial politics that may be part of how the positive sentiment of the people that you find in your research has not yet mapped onto policy implementation. So I would like to ask, for you to think about that in terms of what are the political incentives. And Michael, my question to you specifically is, one part of your presentation you highlighted welfare benefits are actually quite equal for foreign residents. And maybe one area where Japan on the distributional side is ahead of other countries. And that gets to this question of the politics. How did the foreign residents who don't have political rights gain substantial equality on benefits? And we're not seeing the politicization of turning against minorities in political campaigns, and we're not seeing it in the denial of benefits. And so that's the flip side of this political story. So those are my two questions. Hold your thoughts, because we have Hikaru Yamagishi, who's going to ask a question. She's a postdoctoral fellow with the program in US-Japan relations. We'll then let you add a few brief responses and then open up to the full audience.
Hi, thanks, Christina, and thank you, Michael and Nick. I have one question each for each of you. So first, Michael, thank you for covering so much. This was fascinating and so broad in its scope and its depth. I wanted to hear more about the transition from the multi-ethnic empire to this monoracial liberal democracy in the post-war years. And that comes from wanting to understand what the motivations of the foundations of contemporary Japanese government were in either espousing, codifying, all the various ways that they put in these norms that were supposedly in line with international communities. What the motivations were, I think, gives us a little more insight into how we've diverged or why it's diverged in terms of the implementation. So I just wanted to know about how those end of war negotiations went and what was actually implemented. And Nick, thanks for telling us about both your recent project and your former publication. A lot to think about. I am convinced that the public is in line with main Western counterparts. But as Christina said, I think the common conception from Japan being either insensitive or racist or lacking in active anti-racism comes from kind of the next level up of not how people deeply assess human beings, but how that's constructed through social structures. So I'm wondering, in what you measure in your survey, let's take the most recent survey, how do you think that is in real life, not from your survey results, but those attitudes, how do you think they come up in public discourse or public action, or what can we take away in terms of what is actually being expressed by the Japanese public, perhaps to their representatives? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, and great questions. And I think I can tie the two questions together. So for Christina, yes, it's a grim picture, but I also think it's a bright picture. And here's why. I have a great confidence in Japan's liberal democracy. And I think part of what we're seeing, the gains that have been made, have been through coalition politics within Japan's liberal democracy. And many of the gains that have been made in terms of the welfare benefits were done by the Zainichi Korean community, right? Because of their longevity of being there and their own activism that was actually inspired by the civil rights movement and their connections with the World Council of Churches. And so Erin Chung has actually written quite a bit about this, and some others, Waji Shin. And so I think that bodes very, very well. The problem is that it's true that the state and all states create hierarchy. The problem is how we're going to get these two, for example, the older groups that are more privileged and the newer groups that are less privileged together. And that's another coalition that could happen. I do want to point out, though, that for example, the group Zaito Kukai, they're actually, it's a group against the special privileges for Korean residents, and so there is resentment about that, indeed. Also, I didn't include it here, but there has been racism in politics. I have here in 2000, the Tokyo governor Ishihara said in a speech that illegal foreigners were committing atrocious crimes and that foreigners would cause civil disorder and a national disaster. In 2002, he says, that, of course, he's an alarmist and a propagandist. He says the Chinese people have criminal DNA. In 2016, let's see where the skip. The former head of the Zaito Kukai won 110,000 votes in the 2016 Tokyo election for calling for no public assistance for non-Japanese people resident in Japan. On the other side, though, I know I'm painting a grim picture, there have been people of foreign and origin elected to national and local politics, even recently. I have a slide, but I didn't, running out of time. So there was one Caucasian who was actually a member of the Japanese parliament from Finland. Madute Surunen, and he told me so. And there's also, of course, mixed race people, Korean and Japanese, Taiwanese and Japanese. And in the Tokyo municipal elections, actually there are people from of Indian and Bolivian origin have been elected. So I have confidence that Japan as a liberal democracy will continue to foster this type of advancement. But politics has very strange bedfellows. So let me get to your question. I hope that answers that. So why the move from mono-ethnic nationalism to from let's say multi-ethnic nationalism to mono-ethnic nationalism? A lot of it has to do with Cold War politics. The Korean and Chinese resident populations in Japan, they were afraid of unrest. So both the occupation authorities, the US occupation authorities, and the Japanese authorities thought that it's better that we have very strict immigration regimes. So anti-communism, which also brings me to another strange bedfellow that I wrote about in the Washington Post about the connection between the LDP, right, and the Unification Church, which were tied because of anti-communism. Right. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks.
So, okay, so the two questions are, how do we reconcile public attitudes, weak politics, but also what does the public really think? What do they see in their daily lives? What might not be captured in surveys? I think all survey-based studies have limitations. The one thing that I would say is one thing that's unique about the surveys that I ran is that the samples were more representative than most newspaper surveys. And we asked the question in a variety of ways to really sort of make sure that it wasn't, we asked the question this way, and so we got that particular answer. That said, I think what I've learned from the research I've done so far, is that whether it comes to foreign workers or refugees, a lot of people don't think about these issues in their daily lives yet. And I say yet because that will change. That's the difference I see between Japan and European countries. In European countries, these issues have been there for 20, 30, 40, 50 years or whatever. And so they see it in their daily lives and it's become politicized. I don't think immigration has really yet become politicized. And part of this comes down to the fact that really politicians don't want to talk about this issue. And a lot of the qualitative ethnographic research I've done, I've interviewed bureaucrats with the Ministry of Justice, Immigration Bureau, now the Immigration Service, and they told me that they were strong supporters of bringing in more foreign workers, having a Canadian-style point system, and they were pushing for it 10, 20 years ago. It's just that the politicians didn't want it because they were afraid that there would be a public backlash. And I think a lot of this comes down to risk aversion. The politicians particularly don't want to politicize the issue. They're very risk averse towards that. And even thinking about foreign workers as immigrants is, I still think, problematic for a lot of politicians. So if you're electing, let's be honest, I mean, older, small c conservative people to public office, they're probably going to have more conservative policy preferences, and they're going to be most sensitive to any kind of perceived movement on this issue. I know for a fact that the bureaucrats I talked to were very frustrated, actually, that the politicians wanted to hold policy back. The Ministry of Justice, Immigration Bureau, they had actually been talking about reforming immigration for at least 10 years before they actually did it in 2018. And they were trying to put pressure on the LDP, like this needs to happen because otherwise our economy is going to suffer. And we know this can work. And they had done focus groups and talked to people in major metropolitan areas. There wasn't any resistance to it. It was just that the politicians were so afraid that this might become politicized. So I think a lot of it comes down to politicians being risk averse, but also I mean, there are pre-existing biases among, people who have negative images of Chinese people or Zainichi Koreans or whatever. And the last thing I'll say about that is, as we would expect in, say, the American case, where negative attitudes towards Latinos or African Americans also predicts opposition to immigration, the same is true in Japan with Zainichi Koreans. If they don't like Zainichi Koreans or Chinese, they probably don't want immigration. So I think navigating the complexity of this really has to start with more politicians being able to say, okay, we're going to talk about this, but we're going to try to do it in a way that is not going to turn up raise the temperature and freak people out, but also in a way that will actually move the agenda forward policy-wise. I think there's just been a lot of risk aversion and people being afraid to even touch the issue because they imagine that it will explode.
I wish more American politicians were afraid to talk about the issue and worried about whether it would explode. I'd like to take some more questions from in the room, and then we have several online that I'll turn to. So in our audience in the room, go ahead, Mary Britton, Director of the Reischauer Institute.
I learned so much from both of you. It was just marvelous. My questions, I have two questions for Nick. You showed the relationship between the level of humanitarianism and attitudes towards refugees. If you take a step back, can you say more about the level of humanitarian attitudes in Japan? For instance, if you compare them to other countries. In other words, I believe the relationship, but the overall, what's the overall level, the absolute level? It's relative to other countries, relative. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, so we didn't measure that because we only ran the survey in Japan. And what I would say is that because it's a psychological metric, I actually don't think it matters how we compare across countries because it depends on the individual, right?
What do you mean you don't, how it?
Because it's psychological,
Right.
right? So it depends, what you're asking is why are people humanitarian? That depends on the individual person. I don't think that has anything to do with national culture or anything like that. In fact, psychologists have proven that it has nothing to do with the environment. It's all psychological. So ideally, I would have a comparative measure of that, but I think that would distract from the fact that it's not about, comparing different nations. It's comparing individuals. It's an individual disposition.
I would battle with you a little bit,
Sure.
but I want to get to my second question. I would battle with you a little bit because levels of social trust, when social trust is measured in Japan, it tends to be much lower than a lot of other countries. And not social trust, meaning not trust in institutions, but trust in people you don't know.
Sure.
So I think, so I would debate with you. I would love to debate.
What I would respond to that with is that if you look at anxiety and trust in others, that's a completely different psychological mechanism. And what I would say
than
is,
humanitarian.
yeah, absolutely. So what we argue in the paper is that an individual within the same person can have competing psychological impulses.
Sure.
You can have low trust in institutions and be very sensitive to perceived threats, but also have a strong humanitarian sentiment. And the key is the situational trigger, right?
Yeah.
So in different situations, my humanitarianism might, be more present, whereas in others, maybe it's the fear, maybe it's the anxiety.
Yeah.
So I agree with you that it's not just one thing, but what I would say is based on the psychological literature, it's a lot, this is all individual and they can coexist. And it really depends on the situation.
Okay, I'll just state my second question, but I want other people to have a chance. So that actually gets to my second question, which we don't have time to get into, but we can talk later. Some of the specific questions in the survey experiments, because I just wondered about those, because exactly as you just said, the closer you get to an actual situation, if people are going to be negative, that's when it's going to come out, right? I mean, you can ask general questions about how you feel about foreigners in Japan or something. That's very abstract. How would you feel about renting to a Pakistani or something like that? So, but we could, it has to do with the design, so I can read your work and,
Yeah, the thing that I would say is that that is exactly why I did situation-specific
yeah. Okay.
experiments. So these weren't, I mean, I asked broad questions, but with the refugee admission experiment, it was, here's a specific crisis.
Great.
Here's exactly what the government would do. What do you think? How many should we take? Are you opposed to this aspect of the policy? What do you think about that aspect of the policy? That, in addition to just the broad questions about should we admit refugees, should we take in long-term foreign workers? Happy to talk more in the Q&A, but I totally agree. These are very valid concerns.
We can talk later.
Other questions in the room? Yes, Tomoki Matsuno of the Undergraduate Policy Network.
So thank you both so much for your very insightful presentations. And I have a very quick question for Dr. Fraser. And it's also about your point, the support for hosting refugees is based on humanitarian support. And I think your point was more about among citizens, but I think I'm kind of curious to know how much that's the international reputation as Japan, Japan's international reputation matter for policymakers. So I think one recent example of this is Ukraine, and I think Japan was really quick to processing applications from Ukrainian refugees, and there was absolute support from citizens, but at the same time in other countries accepting refugees, and I think Japan was kind of in a sense pressure to accept Ukrainian refugees to keep its international reputation. So I'm kind of curious how that kind of Japan's positions as kind of in a international community affect policymakers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters. If you look at the 1970s and 1980s, there was a lot of pressure to admit Indo-Chinese people, the boat people, from the US, and they put pressure on Korea to do the same, right? So that obviously matters, but my argument is not about what the state will do in this talk. It was about what does the public think? So yeah, I mean, I think that matters, but it probably matters more for political elites.
But I wanted to turn that question to you, Michael, because the international side is very much part of your story of the state manipulation of racism.
Yeah.
Do you feel that Japan learned its approach to hierarchical racism from the European imperial attitudes?
I didn't really think of that, because I think if anything, it's an adaptation. But I will say though that I think that accession to those conventions, I think that the reputation in the international community is very, very important. For example, the signing of the CEDAW, right, for the Convention Against Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Because of that, that's why nationality is you get it through both parents now, right? Before it was just men, but in 1984 that changed that for the whole world, and Japan wants to be in that club of, and it is in that club of respected, liberal, democratic, rich democracy. So I think the international convention is very, very important, very, very important.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to take a few of the online questions and then turn back to our room if you have any other questions left. So we do have Walter Hatch asking Michael about how much is Japanese view of white residents a special form of racism? And also we have Willie Zhao asking you, what is the role of public education system contributing to the narrative of racial homogeneity? Those are two questions to Michael. And while you're thinking of your answer, I have two questions for you, Nick. Trevor in Charity is asking about the change with the increase in 2021, and how much is it that adverse shock where there weren't enough immigrants gave more momentum to the demographic argument? And you also have a question from Yusaka Horiuchi about the possibility of favorability bias, that people, when they're answering questions on a survey, often want to look nice. And so what do you think is the favorability bias that may come up in your survey? He also has a second question that I think you should read rather than I.
Okay, to the first question.
We'll go ahead and turn
sorry.
to Michael to
My
answer while you
apologies.
think of your response.
Okay, on the first one, I think that that racism, That's part of the reason why I use this comparative racial politics framework, right, developed by Hanchett and Chung, because you can also measure across context. So context is very, very important. So I think in the Japanese case, there are two sides to this, right? On the one hand, racism converges with white supremacy, right? So there are different types of racism in the world. They converge with white supremacy. For example, the whitewashing of Naomi Osaka, who you might think, well, Japanese people even portray themselves, right, in manga and otherwise as white. But you think about skin lightening products in Japan and all over Asia, right? And on the other hand, though, I think the Japanese style of racism has a lot to do with a civilizational discourse, where the whiteness and the level of development, they converge. So that is why you will find some African Americans, for example, they feel much freer in Japan, right? Because they come from America. On the other hand, you will find Africans doing caricatures of African Americans to try to get that status, right? That gives them freedom. So that's my answer on that. But I think I'll tell you a quick story. One time I was in Roppongi, and a tall white guy, I assume from the States, he asked me, "Hey, do you live here?" And this is in the mid 90s or later 90s. And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Why won't any cab stop for me?" And I just smiled. That's the first, because nowhere else can that happen but Japan, I think, right? Okay, so all right, on the education thing, there was DOA education, but I don't think there's much discourse about foreign people in education or foreign communities. The DOA education, the special law, the law and special measure for DOA, it terminated in 2002. But what this did was provide what they call human rights education. And the target was to make people aware of the Baraku problem. But this really, it's not very well enforced. It depends on where you live. And so that is, there is some multiculturalism, a discourse of multiculturalism that many would say is very superficial. But that's certainly needed, a discourse on education.
All right, so I'll say with research methods, I think due to time, like I'll let Horiuchi Sensei read the paper. I didn't do a choice-based conjoint. There's trade-offs to how you do this. I think that social desirability bias affects all experimental studies, and we could go into the weeds on that, but I don't think that would be interesting. So I'm going to pivot to his other question about, what about this new trend of highly educated and skilled workers? Like, do they have incentives to go to Japan? And I think that's a very important point. Yeah, I mean, if you ask people, there have been recent studies that ask, immigrants in East Asian countries, like, do you want to be here long term? Why are you here? A lot of them have complained about that. But the other thing that I think that sort of speaks to is, if you are a person in your 20s or 30s and you're thinking about where you want to put roots down or where you want to, be, Asia is attractive, but there's a lot of issues that companies have with retaining people because of norms and corporate culture. And so I think that that is also a major factor. So I think the larger structural economic factors, such as the weak yen and migration trends matter, but I also think we have to look at the corporate culture as well. In terms of why public support for immigration increased, it's very interesting, and I would agree with what Trevor suggests, where he says that people felt the adverse economic effects because of a lack of immigrants and tourists. I think absolutely. The pandemic really sort of created this weird effect where the border was closed, and technically they had a more liberal immigration policy, small L liberal, but there weren't more people coming. So, I think a lot of people haven't really felt the increase in immigration in their daily lives yet. So it is more abstract. So yeah, I think that's probably what's going on. And I would suspect that if you asked people what has had a huger impact on Japanese society in the last 2 years, is it the pandemic or is it this immigration reform? I'm guessing most people would probably say the pandemic would have had more of an impact on their daily lives. So I suspect that's what's going on, but we need to do more research to really unpack that. So.
Great. We can take a couple more questions from the room. We have room for 2 more questions. Don't be shy. This is an interesting, thought-provoking.
I'm a visiting scholar of the US Japan program. Thank you for very thoughtful comment presentation. My question is whether Japan is historically speaking to what extent racist. After World War I, Japan is the first country to propose an anti-racism treaty in the international community. And also, during the World War II, or before the World War II, we have a foreign minister who is a descendant of the Koreans. And recently, we have a Taiwanese minister, and naming her name with a Chinese family names. Of course, you mentioned about of the Governor Ishihara. I don't say that every Japanese is anti-racist. And one example can be also the only example. So I don't know how far Japan is racist countries comparing to the other countries. I want to hear your comment. Thank you.
Oh, if I may.
Yes, please.
Yeah, maybe
Consul-
adding to the last question.
Consul General Kotaro
Rather,
Suzuki.
yeah, thank you. This is my just not a question but a comment maybe. It goes with the slightly uncomfortable feeling in me when I hear the term racism used to describe the situation. I know the legally the treaty against the racial discrimination, of course, adopts the definition which includes the rather broader sense of discrimination. But as a Japanese, I don't think that the brief introduction of the Western thought of about the races survived the last century. So I think it was discontinued after. When I don't know, I haven't studied, but now I admit that there is a strong biases and the feelings of discrimination based on the ethnicity and historic relations. But I can't imagine that people are feeling that they are basing their ideas about different races. Rather, yes, just as Professor said, the ethnicities or their ethnic identity. That could be true. This was my comment to your question.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
All right.
Final.
First of all, Japan is no more racist than any other modern state, right? Because every modern state has used racism, right, as part of its political, development. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Britain and the disciplining of the Irish people. Irish people were painted like monkeys and in cages and so on, even right here in the United States. So this is part of state building. That's the point. But the irony with Japan, though, is that it's the first non-white, non-Caucasian state to emerge to that level of modernity, and that's what makes it very interesting. And so you see some things that repeat actually the trajectory of other advanced societies, but it's a little bit different because it's non-white. So, so Japan is no more racist than any other country. I mean, it's part of being modern. Unfortunately, is race is a false concept, right? But it's a concept that is alive. You know, in Japan, and in the UK, in the United States, everywhere.
I think that Japan is a complicated society with a lot of contradictions, as all human societies are. And I mean, at a gut level, I would say that I'm actually very optimistic because I think Japan has dealt with a lot of challenges in the past very well. And I see Japan as really sort of at the beginning or the early stages of a longer process that will probably take generations, maybe hundreds of years to work through. But I'm confident that Japan can master immigration and dealing with multiculturalism and people from different backgrounds. So I'm actually optimistic. I know there's going to be a lot of challenges, but my hope would be that we have more leaders who are more willing to talk about these issues and not try to treat the public like they're, well, you know, they're kids. We can't talk about this because, you know, they just won't understand. I actually think the Japanese public is a lot more sophisticated than politicians give them credit for.
Just one thing on the racial equality proposal. What's so interesting is that you know, that becomes a norm in international relations. But the motivation for the Japanese proposing the racial equality proposal was because of their own insecurity about being non-white.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it was about about immigration, Japanese immigration being stopped in the US and the Anglo-Saxon countries. So it's so funny and so ironic that we're talking about immigration, and I love your analysis, you know, that you know, there's no ill or negative attitude really, but it's so interesting that the motivation for that was Japanese immigration, and we're talking about immigration. So that's
And the tragedy that the Japanese delegation came to Versailles wanting racial equality and some concessions in China.
right. Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, in a meeting where a majority supported Japan's proposal for racial equality, said, on this, there shall be consensus, and let the British and American veto racial equality.
Yes.
Well, then they gave concessions on territorial expansion.
Yeah.
We can only wonder if the US and Europe had a different message to Japan, how would the interwar legacy have
Definitely.
shifted?
Yeah.
But it is complicated on the international front, and I'm glad that on the societal front we can see signs for optimism. I think that is really encouraging. And thank you both for this incredible research that you're sharing with us and continuing. We look forward to reading your books.
Thank you.
Good luck, and thank you all for joining us in a lively discussion.
Thank you.
Right.